Have you ever wondered what really goes on in the mind of someone who cheats? The answer might be darker and more complex than you imagine. Prepare yourself for a true story that will leave you breathless. Today we are going to dive into the case of an ordinary, seemingly happy man who found himself tangled in a web of lies and betrayals. A story that exposes human frailties and the devastating consequences of infidelity. But before we continue, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any impactful videos like this one. Your subscription is very important to us. Now focus back here. The story we are about to reveal is so intense that you won't want to miss a single detail. The story of Ricardo Tavares begins on a completely ordinary Monday morning. He woke up at 6:15, just as he had for 14 years. The alarm played that same irritating tune, and he shut it off with the automatic gesture of someone who has repeated the same movement for so long they don't even need to open their eyes fully. Beside him, Mariana was still asleep, her face turned toward the opposite side of the bed, as had become habitual in recent months. Ricardo watched the brown strands spread across her pillow for a few seconds, feeling something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger, it wasn't love, maybe it was just emptiness. He got up in silence, walking barefoot across the cold floor to the bathroom. In the mirror he found the reflection of a 42-year-old man who looked 10 years old. The dark circles under his eyes, the gray hairs at his temples increasing every month, the belly that kept growing despite promises to return to the gym. When had everything changed? When had he become this stranger staring back at him? The house gradually woke up. First, Lucas, the 16-year-old son, who walked right past him muttering an almost inaudible good morning, glued to his cell phone as if the device were an extension of his body. Then Julia, the 12-year-old youngest, more cheerful, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek before running to grab her school uniform. Mariana appeared last, already dressed for work, with that air of professional efficiency she always maintained in the morning. They exchanged the necessary words, nothing more. Arrangements about who would pick up the kids, reminders about bills to pay, questions about appointments, a conversation of logistics, not of life. Ricardo drove to the office listening to the same podcast he listened to every morning, about economics and investments. But his mind was far from those market analyses. He thought about the last time he and Mariana had truly talked, not just exchanged information about the domestic routine. When was the last time she had looked at him with that sparkle in her eyes she used to have in the early years of their marriage? When was the last time he himself had felt alive, genuinely alive, not just existing on autopilot? The accounting office where he had worked for 18 years was one of those places utterly devoid of personality. White walls, gray partitions, artificial plants that never needed watering, the air conditioning always set to the same temperature. Ricardo greeted the receptionist, nodded to a few colleagues, and headed to his office. Financial manager, a title that sounded important but which in practice meant spending 8 hours a day analyzing spreadsheets, handling calls from unsatisfied clients, and participating in endless meetings. It was when he was getting his coffee in the break room, at 9:30 in the morning, that everything began to change. Or maybe it had started before, and he simply hadn't noticed. Beatrice entered the break room at that moment, carrying her favorite mug, the one with a funny phrase about Monday. She was on the marketing team, had joined the company 6 months ago, and Ricardo had barely exchanged words with her beyond formal corridor greetings. "Good morning, Ricardo. Running away from your desk for a breath too?" She smiled, and there was something about that smile that was different, genuine, warm, as if she really cared about the answer. Ricardo laughed. "Yeah, sometimes I need to remember there's life beyond the spreadsheets. I totally get it. I spend all day creating campaigns to sell products that half the time I don't even know exactly what they do." She poured her coffee, added 2 spoons of sugar. "Sometimes I wonder if anything we do here really matters, you know?" And it was that sentence, that single sentence, that touched something deep inside Ricardo. Because it was exactly what he had been feeling for months, maybe years, but had never been able to articulate. Yes, he knew exactly what she meant. They talked for 15 minutes in that break room. About work, about life, about that shared feeling of just going through the motions, without truly living. When Ricardo returned to his office, he realized he was smiling, a genuine smile, not the social smile he maintained all day long. And he also realized it was the first real conversation he had had in weeks. The following days brought more casual encounters. In the break room, in the elevator, in the parking lot. Conversations that lasted 5, 10, 15 minutes. Ricardo learned that Beatrice was 34, divorced, childless, living alone in a small downtown apartment. She talked about books she was reading, about the yoga class she had started, about the dream of one day quitting everything to open a small coffee shop. There was a lightness about her that Ricardo had forgotten existed, a capacity to marvel at simple things, to find beauty in everyday details. And then 3 weeks after that first coffee, Beatrice invited him out to lunch. Nothing major, just lunch between colleagues, she said. There's a new Japanese restaurant that opened nearby. I'm dying to try it, but I hate eating alone. Are you in? Ricardo should have said no. Some rational part of his brain, the part that still functioned with logic and common sense, screamed at him to politely decline. But another part, a part that had been dormant for a long time and was now waking up hungry, wanted to say yes. It wanted to feel that excitement again, that anticipation of something new. He said yes. The lunch was pleasant. More than pleasant, it was invigorating. They talked about everything and nothing, about childhood, abandoned dreams, secret fears. Beatrice had a way of asking questions that made Ricardo genuinely think about his answers. They weren't superficial questions, of whether or were. They were questions about what he really felt, about what he truly wanted out of life. And you, Ricardo, if you could change one thing in your life right now, what would it be? He hesitated, swirling the sake in the small glass. Honest, that's what she possessed. A naked honesty that was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. I would change the feeling of just existing, of being on a treadmill that never stops running without going anywhere. You know, when you look back and realize the last 5, 10 years have just been one big repetition of the same day. Beatrice nodded slowly, her dark eyes fixed on his. I know exactly what you mean. That's why I got divorced. One day I woke up and realized I was married to a stranger, living a life I hadn't consciously chosen. It had just happened. And then I asked myself, is this it? Is this all life is going to be? Ricardo felt something stir within his chest, an identification so profound it was almost painful. He had never been able to explain this to Mariana, never been able to make her understand this restlessness that consumed him. But Beatrice understood, without judgment, without defenses. She simply understood. They returned to the office together, walking slowly, stretching out that moment. When they said goodbye in the elevator, Beatrice lightly touched his arm. Thanks for lunch, Ricardo. It's been a long time since I've had such a good conversation. That night at home, Ricardo was distracted. Mariana asked if he was okay. He said yes. But the truth was his mind was miles away, reliving every moment of that lunch, every word, every look. When he lay down in bed, beside the sleeping Mariana, Ricardo stared at the ceiling in the dark, feeling more awake than he had been in years. The lunches became weekly, then twice a week. Ricardo started looking for excuses to pass by the marketing department, a document that needed review, a question about a project, anything that would give him the opportunity to see Beatrice, to exchange a few words, to feel that connection that had become addictive. And it was gradual. There wasn't a specific moment when the line was crossed. It was more of a slow, constant slide. Conversations became more intimate. Lunches stretched longer. They started exchanging messages outside of work hours. First about office-related matters, then about anything. Good morning. Good night. How was your day? Thinking of you. Thinking of you. Ricardo typed that message one night already in bed while Mariana slept beside him. He stared at those 3 words on his phone screen for long minutes before hitting send. And when Beatrice's reply arrived, I'm thinking of you too, something inside him definitively broke. They planned coffee after work. Just coffee, Ricardo told himself. Just 2 friends, grabbing coffee. There was nothing wrong with that. But when they were sitting in that small, cozy cafe, with the soft light of the lamps creating an almost unreal atmosphere, when Beatrice reached across the table and touched his hand, when their fingers naturally intertwined as if they had always been meant to, Ricardo knew he was lost. I shouldn't be doing this, he said. But he didn't let go of her hand. Me neither, Beatrice replied, her eyes shining. But I'm tired of living by the shoulds. I'm tired of denying what I feel just because it isn't convenient. And there, in that cafe, with their hands intertwined and the world outside following its indifferent course, Ricardo made a decision, or rather, he let the decision be made for him, carried by a current that was stronger than his own will. The first kiss happened in the office parking lot. 3 days later, it was late. Most employees had already left. Ricardo was walking to his car when Beatrice appeared beside him. They stood there, facing each other, the tension between them so palpable it seemed to have physical substance. And then she leaned in, or he did, or they both did at the same time, and their lips met. It was a hungry, desperate kiss, loaded with all the accumulated desire of the past weeks. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless. I have an apartment 10 minutes from here, Beatrice whispered. Ricardo knew he should go home. He knew Mariana was waiting for him, that he had promised to get back early for dinner with the family. He knew he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But in that moment, with the taste of Beatrice still on his lips, and his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode, the voice of reason was just a distant whisper he chose to ignore. "I'll follow you," he said. Beatrice's apartment was small and cozy, full of real plants, scattered books, photos on the walls. It had personality. It had life. It was so different from the organized, impersonal house where Ricardo lived. They barely closed the door before they were in each other's arms again. Clothes dropped along the path to the bedroom, and when Ricardo finally touched her, truly touched her, he felt as if he was waking up from a deep sleep. Every touch, every kiss, every sigh was an affirmation that he was alive, that he was still capable of feeling, of desiring, of being desired. Afterward, lying intertwined in the messy sheets, Beatrice traced lazy circles on his chest. "Do you regret it?" Ricardo should have said yes. He should have dressed quickly, invented some excuse, left and never looked back. But the truth was, he didn't regret it. On the contrary, he felt more alive than he had in years. "No," he whispered, "I don't regret it." And that's how it began. What should have been a one-time mistake turned into an affair that lasted months. Ricardo became a master at creating excuses. Meetings that ran late, urgent projects, necessary overtime. Mariana accepted everything without much questioning. After all, he had always been a dedicated worker, always put his career first. Why would it be different now? But the guilt was always there, a constant weight on his chest. It grew every time he looked at Mariana, every time Lucas or Julia asked why he was always so busy, every time he had to lie about where he was, or what he was doing. Guilt was a physical presence, a knot in his throat that never completely untied. He tried to break up with Beatrice 3 times. The first time, he went a whole week without talking to her, ignoring her messages, avoiding her at the office. But the yearning was unbearable. Not just physical, although that was intense, but the lack of that connection, that feeling of being completely understood. By the end of the week, he was knocking on her apartment door at 11 at night, in the rain, saying he couldn't stay away. On the second attempt, he was firmer. He sat with her, explained that it couldn't continue, that he had a family, that it wasn't fair to anyone. Beatrice cried, he cried, and they swore that would be the last time. It lasted 4 days. The third time, he couldn't even say the words. He looked at her and all his resolve simply evaporated. He was trapped. Completely, desperately trapped. And so Ricardo began living 2 completely separate lives. In one, he was the dedicated husband, the present but distant father, the competent professional. He arrived home on time when he had no excuse to be late, had dinner with the family, asked about the kids' school, watched television next to Mariana. But his mind was always somewhere else, counting the minutes until he could see Beatrice again. In the other life, he was a different person. With Beatrice, he laughed more, talked about his dreams, admitted his fears. They explored new restaurants, went to art exhibits, spent entire afternoons just talking. She made him feel young again, as if life was still full of infinite possibilities. But maintaining 2 lives is exhausting. Ricardo started making small mistakes. He forgot their wedding anniversary for the first time in 14 years. He called Mariana Beatrice once, in the middle of a conversation, and had to invent a flimsy excuse about a colleague. His cell phone rang at odd hours, and he rushed to silence it. He started having insomnia, lost weight, and developed an ulcer from all the stress. Mariana noticed that something was wrong, of course. She wasn't stupid. She would ask if he was okay, if there was anything he wanted to talk about. But Ricardo lied, always lied, saying it was just work, stress, exhaustion. And a part of him hated himself for it. Hated transforming into this man who deceived, who lied, who betrayed. But even so, he couldn't stop, because with Beatrice he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Passion. Desire. The electrifying sensation of being chosen, of being wanted, of truly being seen. With Mariana, he was just part of the household furniture. A necessary but not particularly noticed presence. With Beatrice, he was the center of her universe. Months passed. Ricardo sank deeper and deeper into the web he himself had woven. The lies multiplied. He had a second cell phone now, hidden in his desk drawer at the office. He had created a secret email account. He was always vigilant, always calculating, always planning his next move, as if playing chess against an invisible opponent. And then Beatrice started asking questions. Questions about the future. About what they were doing. About where it was going. Ricardo, are you going to stay with her forever? Don't you feel suffocated in this marriage? If you're so unhappy, why don't you change things? He didn't have answers. Because the truth was too complex to be reduced to simple phrases. Yes, he was unhappy in the marriage, but there was history there too. There were years of shared life. There were 2 children he loved more than his own life. It wasn't as simple as just deciding to leave. But Beatrice started pressuring him more. She wanted more time. She wanted him to stay entire nights. She wanted him to spend weekends with her. Eventually she wanted him to leave Mariana. I can't be the other woman anymore. Ricardo, I deserve more than crumbs of your time. I deserve someone who chooses me completely. And Ricardo found himself trapped between 2 worlds. Unable to fully choose either of them. Unable to abandon either of them. The pressure was destroying him. He was drinking more, sleeping less. His performance at work was suffering. His boss called him in for a conversation, asking if everything was okay, if something was going on. Ricardo assured him everything was under control, but both of them knew it was a lie. And then on a Friday night, everything collapsed. Ricardo had told Mariana he was working late, month-end closing, urgent reports. But in reality, he was at Beatrice's apartment, celebrating her birthday with a bottle of wine and Thai food. They were laughing, relaxed for the first time in weeks when Ricardo's cell phone rang. It was Lucas. Dad, Mom fell. She's bleeding a lot. I called the ambulance, but I don't know what to do. Please, come fast. Ricardo's blood ran cold. He was on his feet before he even fully processed the words, desperately looking for his clothes. Beatrice, worried, asked what had happened, but he could barely answer. I have to go, was all he managed to say before running out. He drove like a maniac to the hospital, running lights, honking, praying to all the saints he didn't believe in. When he arrived at the emergency room, Lucas and Julia were in the waiting area, both pale, their eyes red from crying. Dad! Julia ran into his arms sobbing. I thought she was going to die. What happened? Ricardo asked, hugging both children, his heart hammering in his chest. It was Lucas who explained, his voice trembling. She was getting something from the kitchen cabinet, climbed onto a chair, and lost her balance. She hit her head on the corner of the table. There was a lot of blood. Dad, a lot of blood. A doctor came out of the emergency room and approached them. Mr. Tavares, your wife suffered a cranial trauma. We need to run some tests. But for now she is stable. She lost a significant amount of blood and has a concussion. But she will be okay. She is asking for you. Ricardo felt his legs weaken with relief when he entered the room and saw Mariana lying in that hospital bed, pale and with her head bandaged. Something inside him broke. She opened her eyes when she heard him enter, and there was something in her gaze. It wasn't accusation, it was worse. It was disappointment. It was understanding. You weren't working, were you? She said softly, and it wasn't a question. Ricardo froze. Mary, don't lie anymore. Please. She closed her eyes, 2 tears tracing down the sides of her face. I'm too tired for any more lies today. And there, in that hospital room with the constant beep of the monitors and the smell of disinfectant, Ricardo realized the magnitude of what he had done. It wasn't just about cheating, about being with another woman. It was about all the lies, all the selfish choices, all the moments he had put his own pleasure above his family. In the following days, while Mariana recovered at home, they finally talked for real. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were screams, tears, accusations. Mariana wanted to know everything: who she was, how long it had been, if he loved her. Ricardo answered honestly, for the first time in months, and every answer was a stab wound to both of them. "Why, Ricardo?" Mariana asked, her voice broken. "Wasn't I a good wife? Didn't I give you a family? What was missing?" And that was the impossible question. Because the truth was nothing specific was missing. The problem wasn't Mariana. The problem was him. It was the midlife crisis, the fear of mortality, the desperate search to feel like he was still alive, that he still mattered, that he was still capable of inspiring passion in someone. "It wasn't your fault," he said, knowing it sounded like a cliché, but being true nonetheless. "The problem was always me." Lucas and Julia heard parts of the conversation. They saw their parents crying, saw the tension that cut the air of the house like a blade. Lucas confronted Ricardo one day, his young eyes filled with a rage that hurt more than anything. "You destroyed our family. Why? Weren't we enough for you?" And Ricardo had no answer that could satisfy a 16-year-old son. How to explain the complexity of adult feelings, the fragility of commitment, the temptation of novelty. How to make a teenager understand that good people can do terrible things, that love and betrayal can coexist in the same heart. Mariana asked for a divorce 3 weeks after the accident. Calm, resolved, without drama. She had consulted an attorney. She already had all the papers prepared. "I loved you, Ricardo. I loved the man you were, the man I married. But this man you've turned into, I don't know him, and I can't live with a stranger anymore." Ricardo signed the papers sitting at the kitchen table, that same table where they had shared thousands of meals, where they had helped the kids with homework, where they had planned vacations and discussed the household budget. 14 years reduced to signatures on legal documents. And Beatrice? She broke up with him the same week. Not dramatically, not with shouts or accusations. She simply said that she had realized something that night when he rushed out. She had seen the panic in his eyes, the desperation, the love he still had for Mariana and the kids, and she had understood that she would never be the priority, that she would never step out of the shadows. "I deserve to be someone's first choice," she said, tears in her eyes. "And you deserve to figure out what you really want in life. But we can't do this to each other anymore. We're just hurting ourselves." And suddenly, Ricardo was alone, completely, devastatingly alone. He rented a small apartment, took some clothes and basic furniture. He saw the kids on weekends, when they agreed to see him, which was increasingly rare. Lucas barely spoke to him. Julia tried to maintain normalcy, but there was a distance there that hadn't existed before. At work, he was just another middle-aged, divorced man. The story had leaked, as stories always do in offices. The furtive glances, the whispers that stopped when he entered. Beatriz requested a transfer to another branch. It was impossible for them to work in the same place after everything. The nights were the worst. Ricardo lay in his new bed, in his empty apartment, and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand how he had ended up there. He had traded an entire life for a few months of ephemeral passion. He had destroyed a family for something that wasn't even real. It was just a fantasy, an escape from the reality he didn't want to face. And the cruelest irony was that now, alone, he realized everything he had lost. It wasn't Mariana he missed, necessarily. It was the life they had built together. It was waking up and knowing he wasn't alone in the world. It was having someone who knew how he liked his coffee, who knew all his quirks and still stayed. It was watching his children grow up, being present for the small moments that make up a life. With Beatrice, everything had been intense but superficial, passion without history, desire without foundation. It was easy to be romantic when you only see someone for a few hours a week, when you don't have to deal with bills to pay, sick kids or a broken-down car. Real life is made up of those mundane things he had scorned. Ricardo started therapy, too late. Obviously, but at least it was a start. Sitting in that office, having to articulate out loud all the terrible choices he had made, he finally began to understand. It wasn't about Mariana not being enough. It was about him not feeling sufficient. The betrayal had been a desperate attempt to prove to himself that he was still desirable, that he still mattered, that he still had something to offer. But you don't build self-esteem by destroying other people. The therapist said, you don't heal your wounds by opening wounds in others. A year passed. Then two. Ricardo settled into his new solitary routine. He worked, went to the gym, cooked for one. He saw the kids when they allowed it, always feeling that distance, that invisible barrier his betrayal had erected. Lucas was still cold. Julia was starting to soften, but nothing was like before. It never would be like before. Mariana rebuilt her life. Ricardo learned from Lucas that she was dating someone, a teacher from the school. Julia attended. A decent, present man who treated her well, and Ricardo felt a pang of jealousy. Yes, but also something akin to relief. At least he hadn't destroyed her capacity for happiness. At least he hadn't completely broken her. He ran into Beatrice once, by chance, at a downtown cafe. It was strange. She was different, more mature perhaps, more self-assured. She was engaged, she shared, to an architect she met on a trip. Someone who chose her completely, without hesitation, without secrets. Ricardo was genuinely happy for her, and he realized he felt nothing anymore. Not love, not desire, not regret. What had seemed so intense, so important, was now just a distant, almost unreal memory. What haunted him most wasn't losing Beatrice, it was losing himself in the process. He had become someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of lying so easily, of compartmentalizing his life so efficiently, of ignoring the pain he was causing because he was focused only on his own pleasure. Months passed like a silent river hiding dangerous currents just beneath the surface. And Ricardo sank deeper into a double rhythm that consumed his days and corroded his nights. He woke up beside Mariana with his heart pounding fast, as if he had been caught doing something terrible, even when there was no immediate sign of suspicion. He spent his days at the office divided between spreadsheets and messages, living with his phone face down and locked, afraid that an unexpected notification might reveal everything. At night he faked normalcy at home, while his mind wandered through memories of Beatrice's perfume, the touches that still burned on his skin, the glances that made him feel unique. But behind it all, the realization slowly grew that it was impossible to control two realities forever. The web was becoming too dense, the threads tangling around him, squeezing, suffocating, threatening to break at any moment and expose the truth he was desperately trying to hide. It was on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday, like so many others, that the first great rupture occurred. Silent, yet devastating. Ricardo was reviewing a report when he received a message from Beatrice. "We need to talk today. It's serious." There was no emoji, no softness, none of that light tone that had become part of their identity. It was a harsh, heavy sentence, capable of making Ricardo's stomach drop as if he were falling off a cliff. He tried to maintain a professional appearance while anxiety climbed through his body like a cold wave. He replied asking what had happened, but the message remained seen for long minutes that felt like eternities. When he finally received a reply, she simply completed, "Today, after work." And it was in that interval of silence that Ricardo realized something was terribly wrong, something bigger than any fight, than any momentary crisis. He felt the world around him narrow, the office walls slowly closing in, as if trying to crush him. When the day finally ended, he drove to Beatrice's apartment, with the sensation of crossing a boundary that could never be undone. The building looked different, colder, more distant, as if it knew what was about to happen. Beatrice opened the door without smiling, without the sparkle in her eyes that always greeted him. She looked tired, worn down, like someone who had spent hours fighting an internal battle. She asked him to come in, but her voice was low, controlled, loaded with contained pain. They went to the living room, and Ricardo realized the table was covered in documents. Printed photos, screenshots of conversations, work check-in, and check-out times. It was like an investigation. as if someone had pieced together, step by step, the entire double life he had tried to balance. Beatrice crossed her arms and dropped the bomb that would explode his world. Mariana came to see me. The words echoed like a gunshot. Mariana knew, and not only did she know, she had been there, in that very apartment, confronting the reality of the betrayal with a firmness Ricardo never would have imagined. He felt the floor disappear. Beatrice continued talking, her voice now choked, explaining that Mariana had discovered everything through a sequence of small clues Ricardo had let slip. Restaurant receipts that didn't match his work schedule, messages deleted but not completely, different perfumes on his clothing, mood swings he couldn't hide. Mariana, using her deep, quiet intuition, had connected every dot. And when she was certain enough, she confronted Beatrice. Before confronting him, she didn't scream. She didn't curse me out. She didn't make a scene. Beatrice recounted, her eyes teary. She spoke to me with a calmness I've never seen in anyone. She just said she wanted to understand how far it had gone. Ricardo felt his throat close. The air escaped. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt in that moment, but the realization that Mariana had faced everything alone, in silence, carrying a suffering he never noticed, or chose not to see. The conversation with Beatrice continued for nearly an hour, but every minute seemed to drag tons of guilt onto Ricardo's shoulders. Beatrice confessed that she didn't want to continue this way, knowing she was destroying a family that had never harmed her. She said she still loved him, but couldn't bear to live in the shadows anymore, like a secondary character in her own story. And then, after all that upheaval, she spoke the words that would end their cycle. "Ricardo, I'm pulling away." There was no drama. There were no shouts. It was just the truth. Simple, cruel, definitive. He tried to speak, tried to protest, tried to promise changes, but Beatrice merely held his hand for a few seconds, and then slowly released it like someone letting go of a goodbye with their fingertip. And that's how the relationship that had made him feel alive collapsed into a devastating silence, leaving only the weight of reality waiting for him outside that door. Ricardo returned home that night with a heart broken into different fragments. The loss of Beatrice, the fear of confrontation with Mariana, the accumulated guilt that now seemed multiplied tenfold. He entered the house slowly, like someone invading their own home, and found Mariana sitting on the sofa, looking at the door as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. The silence that accompanied the first few seconds was brutal, cutting, almost unbearable. Mariana's face was too calm, her eyes red but dry, an erect posture that spoke more than words. She invited him to sit, and when he settled down she finally began to speak, not with anger but with a devastating serenity. She recounted everything she had discovered, every suspicion, every clue. Every night she cried alone while he invented excuses. She recounted how many times she tried to believe him, how she tried to convince herself that it was just a phase, that he would return, that nothing had changed. And then finally, she admitted something that pierced Ricardo like a direct hit. "I didn't lose you to her. I lost you before that when you decided I no longer deserved the truth." On that rainy night, when Ricardo finally decided he would tell Mariana the entire truth, something happened that no mental calculation could have foreseen. He arrived home breathless, his shirt stuck to him from the rain, his heart pounding as if it wanted to escape his chest. He pushed the door open and found the living room lit only by the soft glow of a lamp. Mariana was sitting on the sofa, serious, but not angry. There was something different in her expression, something that mixed calm, relief, and determination. Before he could open his mouth, she raised her hand, signaling for silence. On the coffee table lay a blue folder, full of documents, printed messages, photos, and reports that he recognized instantly. Mariana knew everything, every detail, every lie, every second, and yet, there was something strange. She seemed at peace. It wasn't the explosion he feared. It was something much worse. It was a revelation that would come like an invisible blow. Mariana took a deep breath and told him she had been waiting for this moment for months, that his coldness, his distance, and his lies had not gone unnoticed. But then she uttered the phrase that disassembled everything inside him like a badly constructed building. "Ricardo, you didn't cheat on me first." His mind immediately scrambled. He tried to process it, tried to remember signs, attempts, gestures, any clue he might have missed, but he found nothing. Mariana approached slowly, like someone carrying a truth too heavy to hold on to. She explained that she had been living her own silent hell, that she had found comfort in someone else long before Beatrice appeared, but she never had the courage to confess. What destroyed him wasn't the infidelity itself, but the reason she didn't cheat out of passion, desire, or rebellion. She cheated out of need, out of emotional abandonment, out of realizing that for years he hadn't been there anymore, even while sleeping next to her every night. But the real shock was yet to come. Mariana opened the folder and took out a buff envelope, which she slowly pushed toward him. Inside was a medical report in his name, signed by a psychiatrist. Ricardo's eyes widened, unable to comprehend. The document spoke of dissociative states, fabricated memories, and projective episodes. She explained, her voice trembling, that in recent months, he had been experiencing profound memory lapses, confusing fantasies with facts, mixing up routines, inventing situations that never happened. And then came the final sentence, cold as a blade. Ricardo, Beatrice doesn't exist. His world collapsed into absolute silence. The messages, the meetings, the apartment, the conversations, the kisses, everything was a product of his own mind, an escape created to fill an emptiness he couldn't face. The extramarital affair never happened. The betrayal never existed. He wasn't living two lives, he was losing his own. And in Mariana's eyes, there was something he would never forget. It wasn't hatred, nor pity, it was fear. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure who was really standing before her.